actually going to be using the website along with you guys. So you won't have to, hear me, trying to flip the page. I'm actually going to be on the website, so I'm going to see if I can adjust to using Alt-Tab. So, Romans 15, 22 through 33 is what we'll be talking about this week. But first, what did we talk about last week? Anybody remember?
I'm sorry. I can't remember.
I have a lot of terrible answers. Ongarth, I reject your reality and substitute my own. Okay.
That's a callback.
Yeah. Hey, Kess was on the right track. Care to expound on that, Kess? That's ironic. I should ask Ongarth to get his notes. But yes, I'll just. We talked about how Paul's passion being his mission to be the apostle to the Gentiles. We discussed how he kind of burned with this desire to preach the gospel wherever he went, primarily where no one had preached it before. We talked about how he didn't go to the Jews because that's where a lot of the missionaries had gone, but he wanted to see the gospel spread to the Gentiles. And so as we keep going in chapter 15, we're going to get to see some of the repercussions, some of the results of this desire of Paul's. And we also get to see some of his plans that come about as a result of this desire. So I just going to get someone, could I get someone to just read our entire passage this week, verses 22 through 33, just the whole thing. One person can have it as much as they want. Yes, Dodge. Go ahead, sir.
You said the entire thing, right?
From 22 to 30 to 30, 22 to 33.
Cool. This is the reason why I've so often been hindered from coming to you. But now, since I no longer have any room for work in these regions, and since I have longed for many years to come to you, I hope to see you in passing as I go to Spain, and to be helped on my journey there by you, once I have enjoyed your company for a while. At present, however, I'm going to Jerusalem, bringing aid to the saints. For Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to make some contribution for the poor among the saints at Jerusalem. For they are pleased to do it, and indeed they owe it to them. For the Gentiles have come to share in the spiritual blessing, they ought also to be of service to them in a material blessing. When therefore I have completed this and have delivered them what has been collected, I will leave for Spain by way of you. I know that when I come to you, I will come in the fullness of the blessing of Christ. I appeal to you, brothers, by our Lord Jesus Christ and by the love of the Spirit, to strive together with me in your prayers to God on my behalf, that I may be delivered from the unbelievers in Judea, and that my service for Jerusalem may be acceptable to the saints, so that by God's will I may come to you with joy and be refreshed in your company. May the God of peace be with you all. Amen.
Amen. All right. So tonight is going to be a little different. Tonight is going to be a bit of a history lesson, truth be told. It's not going to be a typical study because you guys know me. I take forever because I typically tend to go word by word and bring out the concordance and regale you guys with Greek meanings of such and all sorts of whatnot. Not going to do that this week. We're going to go through it verse by verse, but we're going to really see what Paul actually had in mind initially. Yes, Kessa, for his trip to Rome. So we'll start off verse 22. Paul says, "This is the reason." Let's stop there. The reason for what? What reason are we talking about here? He says, "This is the reason." What are we? He's obviously referring to something. What are we talking about? Oh yeah, doctor with the broad answer, Kessa narrowing in with the bullseye. Yeah, his focus. He wanted to preach where there had been no preaching, where there had been no churches, where there had been no speaking of the one true God of Jehovah for pretty much the entirety of human history. Exactly. This is the whole reason, we didn't even actually finish Paul's thought in verse 22. The whole thing, he says, this is the reason why I have so often been hindered from coming to you. Why? Because of his desire to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. He was constantly going to new regions to preach as he was led by the Spirit, and as such, he just never made it to Rome. Even though he wanted to be there, he never ended up there. But then we come to verse 23, and it tells us that his work in these regions was complete. He didn't have anything more to do there. He was done. The Spirit had led him, and he had completed his work in that area. And so, since he had wanted to go to Spain, heaven help me, wanted to go to Rome to see the believers for so long, he was hoping that he would get to go by there on his way to Spain. Now, why on earth is Paul going to Spain? Why did Paul want to go to Spain? I was like, hashtag not a trick question. Yeah, he wanted to preach some more. Yeah, Paul just wanted to head west. And he's like, I haven't been to Spain. Bet none of the other apostles have been out there. Why don't I head out there? Exactly. At this point in time, Spain was probably the westernmost lands of known civilization that Paul could have reached. And as far as he knew, the gospel had never been preached over there. So just as he talked about in the early part of chapter 15, he wanted to go there and preach to the Gentiles. Again, it was kind of his thing. That's what Paul did. It was his life's calling. It was his purpose. Now, from the way that Paul is talking here, it indicates that he probably didn't plan on staying in Rome for very long. He says, I plan to be helped on my journey there by you once I've enjoyed your company for a while. It's not a long time that he anticipated being there. He's like, I'm passing through. I want to see you guys because I haven't seen you in Rome and I really want to, but I'm not going to stick around long because I really want to go to Spain. Lost my place. But Rome was still important to him, so he was making it a priority to stop there. The ancient wave. But then we come to verse 25, and it says, "At the present, however," which is just a really long, a slightly more wordy way of saying "but." It says, "But that would have to wait because he still had something else to do." Paul's like, "Listen, I'd love to see you guys, and I'm going to see you on my way to Spain, but there's something I got to do first. There's another task that I have before me." What was that task? What did he have to do? Kess is actually raising her hand. My goodness.
Does that mean I'm called on?
Yes, it means you're called on.
Isn't he taking relief for a famine?
Someone is well versed in this. Yeah, Paul is taking supplies down to the church in Jerusalem. Now, you've expressed a little bit more, and it's not entirely. There's a lot of evidence that points to the fact that famines could have played into part of this, but there are other factors that kind of play into this whole idea. Now, let's start off first. Where did Paul get all of this stuff? How did he accumulate it? Where did it all come from? In Europe, yes. Specifically where? Yeah, where Macedonia and Achaia? You guys know? Yeah, Voidmaster's pretty much got it. It's Greece, kind of the Balkan states area into Turkey. It's pretty much the area where Paul had been preaching and planting churches. This is where he had been ministering, and so what he had done is a lot of these churches that he had planted, he had besought from them to gather an offering because he had heard that the church in Jerusalem was having some hard times. Now, what were these hard times? Well, there had been a number of famines in the range of 40, I think it was somewhere between 42 to 47 AD, I want to say, possibly later. I have to go back and check some of my sources, but there had been some famines that had popped up in the Middle East. There had been one in Egypt. There had been another in Palestine, which had caused a bit of a low or had lowered the production of food. You know, they had crops and the harvest hadn't been quite as good. And so there's that, but there's also another factor to consider in regard to this church of Jerusalem, because the church in Jerusalem is really the only one that sounds like it's getting hit. This is the one that it's primarily getting, that they're providing for. Why isn't Paul raising it for other churches? Okay, Bob says because they don't need help as desperately. Kessa, go ahead.
Helps to unmute. I have no idea for sure, but is it because they're being persecuted especially hard?
Wow.
Give
Kessa, she's on point
Wow.
over there.
Wow, give that girl a gold star right now.
Yeah, that's exactly. Where is Jerusalem? Where is Jerusalem as opposed to so many of these other churches that Paul's planted? Oh my gosh, Kessa is literally siphoning off my notes right now. She said it's ground. I'll read to you the exact line that I have in my notes. I have to find it. Oh, here we go. I called it Persecutionville, right smack dab in the center of Persecutionville. That's, yeah. So that's exactly right. The church was founded in Jerusalem, but that's also the place where the most intense persecution came from, because that's the center of the Jewish nation religiously, and that's where the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all the other C's were based. And so, since they were the strongest in opposition to the teachings of Jesus and what was known as the Way or Christianity, the persecution was most intense. And as a result, it was a lot harder for a Christian, a believing Jew, to get this stuff when other people were treating them with such animosity. And so that's why Paul is looking so intensely towards Jerusalem and wanting to provide for them there, because the other churches aren't facing it nearly as bad. For one, they're more removed from the areas of the famine. Secondarily, it's because the persecution isn't as tough. They have other avenues of getting stuff where it's not like other people are just strictly denying them stuff based upon their religion. So yeah, absolutely great pickup there, Kessa. So Paul also states another reason for wanting to give to the Jerusalem church. He says, listen, if the Gentiles can be part of the spiritual blessings of the Jews, which they are, we talked about that, how the Gentiles are grafted in a number of chapters ago in Romans, then he says, then the least that the Gentiles can do is give of their material blessings to the needy Jews. I mean, that's logic at its finest right there. I mean, that's just Paul being Paul. I don't feel like I need to explain that. Paul has done a pretty good job of that one. And then we come to verse 28, and this is where things get interesting. Because Paul says, now listen, when I've completed all this, when I've taken all this offering and delivered it to the church in Jerusalem, I told him, all the stuff that I've got, and I'll be like, hey, we gathered this stuff, so for you guys, take it because you need it. He says, I will leave for Spain by way of you. That seems pretty innocuous, but this is the point where we really start to see what Paul is planning, what he wants to do. So he wants to go to Jerusalem. He wants to hand over the supplies to James and the church of Jerusalem and be like, okay, cool, I'm out. I'm going to Spain. I'm going to say hey to the people at Rome, give them a high five. I'll talk to y'all later. Okay? In verse 29, he says that when he comes, he will come and bestow upon them the blessing of Christ himself. It's kind of a callback to his role as an apostle. Okay? Through verse 29. Any questions so far? We're good? Any concerns, thoughts, questions? Oh, Kess has got a question. The way she's been answering stuff, I'm kind of scared.
Uh-oh.
What's the special significance of him going to Spain by way of Rome? I feel like I missed that.
There's really no special significance to it yet. I just want you to take note of what Paul says he wants to do. Because up to this point, Paul is just saying, listen, this is what's happened. And you get to verse 28 and he says, this is what I want to do. This is my plan. This is, under ideal circumstances, this is what will happen. I will deliver in Jerusalem. I will leave. I will come to Rome and say, hey to you guys, chill with you for a bit, then go to Spain and keep preaching like I've been doing. Cool?
Got it.
All right. So that was the plan. That was Paul's plan in regards to Rome. So that's the plan. We come to verse 30, and then we see that Paul has a prayer for Rome. Now, we know Paul's not naive. He knows what's going on. I mean, the whole reason for his going to Jerusalem was that the church is right smack dab, as I said, in the center of persecution bill. And we know that the Pharisees didn't really like Paul that much. I mean, especially after that whole, road to Damascus ordeal. So Paul certainly knew that going back to Jerusalem carried with it the distinct potential to cause trouble. And so, because of that, he said he wanted to he elicited these prayers from the saints at Rome. He said, listen, I would really appreciate it if you guys would pray for me in specific regards to this. So he basically says, listen, those Pharisees, they are not really big fans of mine. We don't know. Yeah. So please pray for me. Pray that I would get to Jerusalem safely, that I would supply the offering to the believers there, and that I would get out of Jerusalem safely. Because, I do really want to see you guys. And then he offers this last little statement in verse 33. He says, it's kind of this reassurance to the Roman church. In spite of all the danger that he was potentially heading into, he offers this blessing. He says, may the God of peace be with you all. Now that's really incredible, because you'd think Paul's the one headed into the danger. Why isn't the assurance that the God of peace will be with me? But he says, no, the God of peace be with you all. It is incredibly touching to think that the Roman church, now most of whom Paul hadn't even met. He knew a number of them, including Priscilla and Aquila. But a number of them he hadn't met, but he was so concerned for them in that that they might worry over unnecessarily about him going into this danger in Jerusalem. He said, listen, I understand you're going to be concerned, but listen, the God of peace is going to be with you, and I believe that he's going to give you peace about my safety, because I know that God's got my back. He is the author and the giver of perfect peace, and I know that he is going to give that to you guys on my behalf. You don't have to worry about me. He says, God's got me, and whatever he wants is cool by me. I know he's got me. I know he's with me. He promised he wouldn't leave me or forsake me. You don't have to worry about me. Now, I love that. I think I could probably, yeah, exactly. He already has the peace. Now, I think, you know, I could probably teach an entire lesson on that. But, you know, that's me, and you guys know how I roll. Now, that is the entirety of the passage. That is verses 22 through 33. We've seen the plan for Rome. We've seen the prayer for Rome. But that's not where the study ends, because that's only half of the story. Because Paul's plan and Paul's prayer did not turn out to be the path that he took to Rome. So what did happen? What did happen to Paul? Go ahead, Voidmaster.
Basically, ends up just his presence near the temple instigates a riot. He gets arrested, appeals, basically makes an appeal as a Roman citizen. So he's taken to the governor. The governor finds no fault, but then Paul decides to make an appeal to Caesar, and off to Rome he goes, and lots of things happen along the way.
Yes, very good. So I'll read what I wrote down for you guys. Paul wrote, like he wrote in Romans, Paul did go to Jerusalem, and he delivered the offering from the Gentile churches to the saints there in Jerusalem. He met with James, the rest of the church, told them everything that he had been doing on his missionary journeys, gave them this awesome report of the churches that had planted and the growth of the churches. And it was amazing. He was received very well, and they were overjoyed at the gift that they had brought. It was amazing. Now they wanted Paul to be to have this ritual cleansing, this time of purification, which was supposed to take 7 days. And so Paul's going to the temple, and it's like on the 7th day. It's either the 6th or 7th day. He's almost done with it, and he goes to the temple, and some of these Jews who had seen him on his missionary journeys were there, and they recognized him. And instantaneously he was grabbed, dragged out of the temple, and they nearly beat him to death on the front porch of the temple. But he was rescued by Roman soldiers. He was kept under guard of the Roman soldiers to make sure that nothing nuts happened. But some Jews formed a pact within the city and made this vow that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. And so there was this assassination plot on Paul's life. And so the Romans had to sneak Paul out of the city under cover of night, whereas that happened before, to move him to Caesarea just so the Jews wouldn't try to kill him. When he got to Caesarea, he spent 2 years in Roman custody. Either because the governors were lazy, or they didn't care, or they were catering to Jewish desire. They were like, look, we're not going to kill the guy. He is a Roman citizen, and that just doesn't happen, but we'll keep him locked up. And in desperation, Paul appeals to be judged by Caesar himself. And so in this way, Paul does eventually earn his journey to Rome, but he's not going as the free man that he envisioned, but as a prisoner. So Paul ends up getting placed aboard this ship going to Rome, but a bit over halfway into the journey, they end up in this storm. The storm absolutely wrecks the ship. They end up on this island called Malta. Yay. And while they're there, Paul actually gets bitten by a lethally poisonous viper. He's trying to make a fire. He makes the fire. The snake's like, I don't want to be in a fire. Jumps out and says, that guy put me here. Let's give him a piece of my mind. Jumps out and says, hey, Paul, how you doing? Bites him on the hand. Paul's like, I'm doing fine. Shakes the snake off. No problem. 3 months later, after being shipwrecked on the island, they actually finally get to leave from Malta and complete their journey to Rome. Now, when Paul gets there, guess what happens? As he's coming off the ship, as he's headed into Rome, many of the believers have found out that Paul is actually in Rome, and they go and meet him on the way. These believers that Paul wrote to over 2 years ago, over probably closer to 3 years earlier, come and meet him on the way as he's being escorted in by Roman guards under arrest. But they come and greet him and say, you made it, and they encourage him, and Paul was blessed. Just as he wrote in Romans, he said, I want to be filled somewhat by seeing you. And he was. They met him on the way. And then Paul remained in Rome for 2 more years. 2 more years he stayed in Rome. And he wasn't a free man there either. He was still under house arrest in Rome. And then, Paul said he wanted to go to Spain. Did Paul ever make it to Spain? Honestly, we don't know. I mean, certain tradition states that, after those 2 years, Paul was freed and allowed to travel to Spain before he got arrested again, and eventually was martyred at the hands of Nero. But it's also entirely possible that Paul never made it to Spain. We may never know the answer to that mystery on this side of heaven. We may have to wait and find out from Paul himself when we get to glory. And that was the path to Rome. So now the real question is, so what? So what? Paul had a plan to get to Rome. And he even asked the saints there in Rome to pray for him that he would make it there in the way that he had envisioned. But Paul's path to Rome was a far cry different than what he had actually initially desired. The second half of Romans 15 is a discourse in expectation and desire. But beyond that, it's a study in the designs of God before the desires of man. Paul wanted to get to Rome. He wrote that he wanted to get to Rome. And he eventually did. Just not at all how he had anticipated getting there. He wanted to escape the persecution of the Jews in Jerusalem. He mostly did, but only as a prisoner of the Romans. He wanted to pass swiftly through Jerusalem, and he certainly did that, only to spend 2 years under arrest in Caesarea. He wanted to visit with the Roman believers for a little while, and he certainly did visit with them. But the 2 years that he was there was longer than he had first planned. And that whole house arrest thing hadn't even been in his plan to start out with. And it would be easy to say that Paul's plans and dreams went off the rails by a pretty significant margin. I mean, at every turn, something went wrong. From nearly being flogged in Jerusalem to spending over 4 years under arrest, to being shipwrecked, to being bitten by a snake. Being bitten by a poisonous snake. I'm just trying to make a fire. It's raining. Get bit by a poisonous snake. It was like nothing went Paul's way. Nothing that he had initially wanted went right. He just wanted to get to Rome. Except for one simple fact. That's not the truth. Paul wanted to get to Rome. It's true, he did. But what was the very first thing that he wrote in verse 22? He said, for this reason, I have been delayed in coming to you. And what was the reason that we talked about? He wanted to preach. He had somewhere to be. He had someone to tell about Jesus. That Paul didn't just want to get to Rome. What was it that got Paul evacuated to Caesarea in the first place? You guys know? What got him sent there? Correct. It was a plot on his life. The Jews wanted to assassinate him. Why did they want to assassinate? Ministry to the Gentiles, but also his ministry to them. He wanted to talk to them face to face. The Jewish leaders came before him, and Paul said, "Look, I'm going to talk to you guys," and he did. When Paul was under arrest in Caesarea, do you know what he did? He found himself standing before two of the governors of various regions within the Middle East, and before them he presented the gospel. Before they were shipwrecked on Malta, Paul warned the centurion that was in charge of the journey not to try and make the trip to Rome at that time, because there was going to be trouble. It wasn't going to be good. Oh, the centurion ignored him, and what happened? Shipwrecked on Malta. Now, Paul wasn't the only prisoner on board that ship. There were dozens. And when the storm came up, the Roman soldiers on board the ship wanted to kill the prisoners so that none of them would escape. But do you know why none of the prisoners were killed? Yes, the centurion wanted to save Paul. Why would he want to save Paul? Pretty much. He recognized that Paul somehow knew that the storm was going to happen. And everyone survived the wreck. And you know who predicted that? Paul. And when Paul got bitten by the snake, everyone expected him to die. I mean, they all knew that snake, and it was like, that's a killer snake. Only he didn't. The natives on the island took him to be a god. He must have been impervious to injury. And Paul went around and healed those on the island who were sick, and he gained great repute with those who were there with him. And it opened up doors, and Paul was able to preach to them on the island. That's true. They did initially think he was a murderer, and then he didn't die, and they were like, "Oh, our bad." And then, when Paul did make it to Rome, he was under house arrest, and he wasn't able to travel around freely, so he was stuck in a house with a guard all day. You know what he did? He did some talking. He had a lot of house guests. That's true. He had
Yep.
a bunch of people visiting him. But when the church didn't visit him, he quite literally had a captive audience. There's a Roman guard sitting next to him, chained to him. He said, "Hey, bud, can I tell you about my Lord and Savior?" And how many guards got to hear the gospel because they literally couldn't get away from Paul? And what's more, Paul didn't just do talking in that house in Rome. Paul also had access to some paper and a quill. He did a little writing. You've probably heard of his letters. Today we know them as Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Philemon. the prison epistles. Paul's sitting in prison and he's literally writing the Bible. Paul wanted to get to Rome, and he did. But the path that he took to get there was a far cry from the one he thought he would take. Was it what Paul wanted? Well, not initially. We know that from the prayer that he mentions in the last few verses of chapter 15, or from Romans chapter 15. He tells us, guys, pray for me. Pray that I don't encounter any persecution in Jerusalem. I really don't want that. But I like to think that as the circumstances played out, Paul found that he was receiving unexpected satisfaction and fulfillment from God's unorthodox road for him to Rome. Oh my gosh, Kessa, thank you so much for linking that. That's the key right there. Paul found that getting to Rome was secondary. That's what he had wanted initially, but he found that God had a much greater purpose on the way there. Paul was getting to live out his life's purpose. We talked about it. To preach the gospel to everyone that hadn't heard in ways that he hadn't even imagined. He wanted to take the gospel to Spain. God said, before you get there, I got people that need to hear about it here. And that comes back around to something that we pray a lot, an awful lot around here. God, you get the glory, or by the will of the Father. It's these little phrases that we often attach to our prayers. I know I did it earlier. But the contrast of the will of Paul to the will of God is one that showed just how much Paul really stuck to that mantra of to God be the glory. He wanted to get to Rome. He absolutely wanted to get to Rome. And God intended for him to get there. It's just that he wasn't using Paul's watch or Paul's roadmap. That's a real call to us today. See, God has a purpose for each one of us. And we each have our desires and dreams, things that we want to do, things that we want to see, places to go, people to see, people to become. And, if those are in accordance to the will of God, we'll all reach those goals eventually. But that's just the destination. And there's so much in the middle that God wants to use, just not these end points. So that's the challenge to us. Find your passion in doing the will of God, even when the road isn't the one you planned on taking. Because God's glory comes first. And that's the greatest purpose and the most fulfilling life we can have, to bring praise to our Creator and King. That's everything that I've got, guys. Your thoughts? Go ahead, Kess.
I think the older we get, the more we can relate to Paul's expectations versus what actually happened and the discrepancy in between.
They say experience is the best teacher. And it's honestly true. I look back on my life and I see all the things that, that I've gone through, and I know that I see it in other people's experiences and such, things that I've seen, things that I've encountered, even just this year. And, when you really look, you see the hand of God. And when you make yourself open to it, God does cool stuff. Our God is cool. He consistently blows my mind when I just open myself up to do his will, he just blows your mind.
Yep.
Anything else, guys? What else? That's very true. The transition from bewilderment to some level of understanding can be a long time coming. I think the thing for me in regards to that is that I hope I never lose either of those. I hope I always have a level of understanding saying, yeah, of course God did that. But I hope I never lose the sense of bewilderment in that my God did that. That is not just a God, that is my God. And he did that for me. What did I do to deserve that? And I never want to reach the point where God's work becomes mundane. But I never want to reach the point where I'm surprised that God was able to do something.
If you don't mind, I would like to kind of make a fairly lengthy comment.
Fairly lengthy as in here till 11 o'clock or?
I'll try to keep it under 5 minutes, but I'll try.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I'm just looking at Kessa's remark here, where she says in between can feel like complete and utter failure. I can honestly say I experienced a lot of that, especially in the last 2 years, because, you know, and this is a point you were bringing about Paul, is Paul had an expectation for what it was he had a vision and such. And I'll admit that to some extent, on a personal level, I've had somewhat of a vision that, you know, I want to do, but it's not something that can be realized, you know, in the short run. It's something that's probably going to be a long time before I get to there. But like you said, it's a destination issue at that point. So anyway, so kind of in the midst of the development process, this past year has been really rough in the sense that I have undergone some spiritual warfare that is very unusual, I would say, in its nature, in terms of exactly how it came about, why I don't even know why it would happen, but basically the warfare would get so bad that some nights I wouldn't be able to sleep because I could sense almost like what Job in chapter 4 describes as this presence of darkness that is so, maybe not overwhelming, but it's so strong that like you can't help but stand still and go, my God, what is going on? And it definitely affected my physical health in many ways. You know, from that point going forward, dealt with a lot of muscle tension that would come on me very suddenly, and even now it's still hard for me to deal with at times. Also found myself getting more easily fatigued at things and such, and so on. So, but there were times when just the pain from the muscle tension and sometimes the pain from the spiritual warfare was so intense that there were times that I was finding myself at the end of my rope, literally considering suicide. Also, just literally doing what David said in Psalms, where he is laying on his bed and this is like in between the time when he, you know, of course, just had committed the sin with Bathsheba, but before Nathan came and told him, you know, God has forgiven you. And like David said there in that particular psalm, I think it's Psalm chapter 89, something like that. He says that I weep tears on my pillow every night because like the pain was that intense at times. But what was really interesting was I think it was back around, I want to say around April 28th. That's when the worst night of it was. It was just so bad that I just didn't, I was done, just utterly done. And the ironic part is this was right after I was coming out of Bible college. And so I have about an hour's car ride home where I go to Bible college. So on the car ride home, I finally just said to God, I'm done with this. I can't take it anymore. I'm at the end of my rope. I know what you want from me, but nothing is happening the way I would like it to happen. So God, I'm just really, I'm about ready to call it quits on everything, including life. And it was very interesting. It was at that point when it was like a soft whisper, but kind of how, like I would describe it as a soft whisper directed towards where like the area of my heart is. And it basically, the Holy Spirit just simply said, I know the pain you're going through, and I can understand it, but yeah. But long story short, he asked, but my son went through the same thing. So I do understand it, and I have a plan for you. And so just like Paul here, God had a plan for him, but how he carried out that plan, like you said, came out very differently.
I think that's the one thing that's really, I don't know. I keep coming back to like my favorite chapter of the Old Testament, which is Isaiah 55. My ways aren't your ways. For as the heavens are above the earth, so are my thoughts above your thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And I think even in the case of Paul, who wanted, okay, Bob, we'll see you.
See you, Bob.
In the case of Paul, whose desire was completely godly, he wanted to go to Spain. That's not a bad thing. His thoughts were not, what his desire was not ungodly, but it wasn't what God had planned. God had something way bigger, because Paul wanted to go preach in Spain. That's awesome. But when you consider all the stuff that Paul accomplished, Kessa said that the people on Malta in a war in the 16th century, they said they traced their heritage back to Paul coming to Malta and refused to side with the Muslims. Now, I'm not trying to make a statement, or whatever, but that's a heritage. That his example reached an entire island. You think about what Paul's ministry did to that one Roman centurion on the way to Rome. Think about the countless lives he touched while sitting strapped to a Roman guard in Rome for 2 years. That guard couldn't get away. He's like, it's like Watchmen. I'm not stuck in here with you. You're stuck in here with me.
Mm-hmm.
And then, in perhaps the greatest example, Paul entirely intended to go to Spain a free man. He instead spent 2 years in prison in Rome, and what does he do? He pens 4 books that now comprise the New Testament, a book that has been read for hundreds, over 1,000 years, and has infected the lives of how many people? We get stories about a young man named Onesimus, a story of forgiveness. We get talking about how Jesus Christ is the head of the church, the body, the one that would get all the preeminence. We hear about the armor of God, with the sword of the Spirit, where we rightly divide the word of truth, and we cut through the lies, and we hold up the shield of faith, and we protect our minds with the helmet of salvation. We find out about spiritual warfare, and we learn all of these things. We learn how God makes all things possible to us. And it's just amazing that these words that were penned by Paul while he was under arrest have affected millions of lives since he wrote them. you can't tell me that Paul had that in mind when he wrote Romans 15. It's astounding. And this is just, I believe, one of the best examples of, again, Isaiah 55, how much higher God's thoughts and ways are above ours. Because he has affected just exponentially greater numbers of people than he probably would have had he just gone directly to Spain as he had intended.